Hey y'all, I'm Melissa of the blog Melly Sews and the designer at Blank Slate Patterns. And today we're talking all about sewing knits and different stitches and types of machines that you can use to do that. I'll even show you how to set up a twin needle and use that on your machine. So from zigzag stitches to stretch stitches to sergers to cover stitch and chain stitching, we're going to cover it all today. Okay, let's talk about two important characteristics of knit fabric. The first is the amount of stretch that fabric has. So I've got a piece of fabric here. This is a 10-inch strip, and this would be the selvage edge right here. So the direction of most stretch on knits is always perpendicular to the selvage. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stretch this piece and see how far can I stretch it before it starts to severely distort. So up to 13 inches here, it's still pretty good. 14, I start seeing a little bit of distortion, and I can stretch it all the way down to 16, but the shape starts getting really distorted. So I would say this is a knit with about 30 to 40% horizontal stretch. Now, if we do the same thing, it's only 2.5 inches, but you can check the vertical stretch, and you can see there's much less vertical stretch before it starts to distort. But I can get it up to 4 inches, which is 1.5 inches more than it was to begin with. However, as you see, it kind of distorts and it keeps that shape where it is distorted. So that's not great vertical recovery, but it does have at least 20 to 30% vertical stretch as well on this fabric. This particular fabric is a cotton spandex blend, so it does tend to have pretty good stretch and recovery. As you can see, even when I stretched it down to 16 inches, it does pretty much snap back and get that 10-inch shape right back. That's what's referred to as recovery. Recovery is the amount to which a knit fabric will snap back to its original shape. So now that we've seen how this fabric behaves by itself, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew several different types of stitches, and we can compare how each of those types of stitches behaves on a knit. Okay, I've done two different zigzag stitches here that we're going to be comparing. The first one here, this is just the default zigzag stitch on my sewing machine. It is 3.5 millimeters wide, and it is only 1.4 millimeters long. So this is a pretty short stitch with a medium width. And then here, I've gone to a really long stitch. This one is 4 millimeters long, which is the longest my machine will let me do, but it's only 1.5 millimeters wide. Now let's compare the stretch of these two. Here's the short stitch, and you can see that I'm still able to stretch it a whole lot, like way down to 16 inches, and that stitching has not broken there. However, you'll also notice that the stitching doesn't recover as well. This part of the fabric that was stitched, when it's stretched that far, it does start to get distorted. And if we compare that to the piece that I used, the long and narrow zigzag stitch, you can see this one doesn't quite stretch as much anymore. It still gets down to about 12.5, so it's got about 25% stretch. But for example, I would not recommend this stitch on a neckline or something that might have to stretch quite a bit to fit over somebody's head or be under a lot of tension, because if I stretch it too much more than that 12.5 inches, what's going to happen is the thread's going to break. So definitely the more your zigzag is going back and forth, which is a function of the stitch length. Okay, that's how often it's going back and forth, is determined by the stitch length. That's going to make your stitch stretchier. So had I done maybe like a 1.5 wide zigzag, but only done the same as this, where it's 3.5 millimeters long, it might be quite a bit more stretchy than this 12.5 inches that I can get here. However, the advantage of doing this longer stitch with the narrow stitch width is that it looks almost like a straight stitch for something like a hem. So that would be where you might want to use that over a zigzag stitch that is shorter, like this one. Let's check out some more knit stitch options. This one is called a stretch stitch on my sewing machine. And if you look in your sewing machine, and if it has this stitch, it typically looks kind of like a jagged lightning bolt. It's similar to a zigzag, except as you can see, it appears closer to a straight line because you can't see the zigging and zagging so much. And that happens because it makes one stitch that's slightly zigged, and then it'll start the next one before the end, so they overlap slightly, and that's how it makes it look a little straighter. If you compare it to the zigzag stitch for stretch, this is going to be really similar. It is a very stretchy stitch. So that is the stretch stitch. Not all machines have that, but if yours does, that's another good option besides a zigzag. And another stitch that regular sewing machines can often do is called a twin needle stitch. And this is actually one or two needles that go into one base, and then that one base inserts in your needle holder. And you use two different spools of thread on the top, and then you still just have your one bobbin on the bottom. So you can see how the bobbin thread on the bottom is forced to make the zigzag down there, while these two stitches remain looking like straight stitches. And this one has a pretty decent stretch percentage. You can see though that at the full stretch percentage of this fabric, well, first of all, I can't stretch it more than 13 inches. And secondly, you can see how the stitches start tunneling together when they get stretched very far. But that's another good option. You do need to be careful with twin needle stitching, and I will link a post down in the description here that you don't pull the thread out, because if you pull this thread out of the back, this one bobbin thread, and it breaks or it gets pulled out or it's not knotted off properly, look at how easy that was to pull, first of all. And secondly, once that bobbin thread is gone, all the front stitching goes with it. So twin needle stitching, it can be a good option. It is not necessarily the most sturdy option for stitching. The first step to setting up a twin needle is to make sure you have a twin needle. This is the one I prefer. I like that it's a ballpoint needle because when I use it for sewing knits, that is much less prone to skipping stitches. So all you have to do is loosen your current needle. And then as you can see, the twin needle still has just one shank at the top that you insert. If your machine has a threader, you generally cannot use that with a twin needle. And it's different depending on your machine, but mine says that the current thread path goes through the left needle, so that's what I'm doing here. Next, you have to add the second spool of thread. So on my machine, I have this spool holder, and you'll need to check your machine for how, if you have one, how to use it, etc. But mine goes on the bobbin winder there. And then I put on the second spool of thread and a thread cap to hold it in place. And then it is a matter of threading my machine. And you go through the same thread path as you did before to thread the machine. The only difference is on my machine there's a little bar here, and it recommends to leave the right thread in front of that bar instead of behind it. And again, you have to manually thread instead of using the automatic threader if you have one. And that's it. Now that I've got my needle threaded, I just put my fabric under and begin sewing. Okay, here let's look at a couple of specialty machine stitches. These are not done on a regular sewing machine. So the first example I have here, this is a stitch done with a machine called a serger or an overlocker. And because a serger or an overlocker cuts off the edge of the fabric as it is stitching, this stitch is good for seaming, but you can't use it when you're trying to sew in the middle of something. For example, you can't really use this easily for a hem, or if you want to sew something that's going to be visible stitching that is not on the edge of the fabric. It has two needles here that go through the straight stitch, and then it has two things called loopers that loop over the top and the bottom and loop the thread around the edge of the fabric. You can see those loops there. Because of that looping action, this is an extremely stretchy stitch. You can see that I can stretch it almost out to the full 16 inches that the fabric will let me stretch, and thread isn't threatening to pop at all. It's stretching right along with the fabric. Because of that, a lot of people who sew a lot of knits tend to like to have a serger because those seams are super easy to sew and the machine handles knit really well. If you're interested in seeing what a serger looks like in action, I'm going to link another video at the end of this one where I use a serger to sew something and you can see it in action. And also down in the comments I'm going to have the brands of the ones that I personally use. So that's a serged seam there, or overlocked seam. Then with another machine, which is also in that same video that I'm going to link in the description and at the end of this video, there's another machine called a cover stitch machine. And a cover stitch machine is kind of a combination between a sewing machine and a serger. With a cover stitch machine, you can sew down the middle of fabric because it's not cutting the edge off. But the stitch is still stretchy, and you can do 1, 2, or on some cover stitch machines like mine, you can actually even do 3 needles of straight line stitching on top. Then on the back side, instead of a bobbin, this has a looper like a serger, so that you can see that this thread is looped back and forth, and also that the looper is catching the top threads in a loop. So this makes for a pretty stretchy stitch. This is a 2 needle cover stitch here that I've done, and you can see it stretches down to about 13 inches here. It does kind of do that same tunneling that the twin needle stitching will do. So this one here, this is 1 needle cover stitch. This is also sometimes called a chain stitch. And the reason is the top looks like a straight stitch because it is, and the bottom here is a series of loops or a chain made by the looper on the cover stitch machine. And what that means is that even though this looks like a single straight stitch, it actually has quite a bit of stretch in it because of those loops on the bottom. So if I stretch this, you can see I can get it stretched down to like almost 12 inches. It's about 11 and a half. And with a longer stitch length, I probably would have even been able to stretch this more. But that's another option. Now, disadvantage to a chain stitch is similar to a twin needle. There's just 1 thread looped around on the back side here and 1 thread on the front side holding it. So if you accidentally pull that chain stitch in the right place, you can remove very easily and sometimes even accidentally the entire line of stitching. If you ever think about those older bags of dog food that would have a line of stitching on the top and then loops on the back, that was actually a chain stitch. And you know how if you got just the right thread, you rip the top and the whole top of the bag would come off. They don't tend to use those much anymore, but if you remember those types of bags, that's the same principle in operation here with this stitch. So that's another option for stretch stitching.